All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first program of our Declaration Deep Dive series, which is a collaboration between Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center and Ridgefield Library. My name is Katie Burton. I'm the Director of Education and Interpretation for the museum. I have with me Andy Forsyth, who's the Assistant Director at the Ridgefield Library. I'm going to be moderating this evening. Andy will be behind the scenes, making sure that everything goes smoothly via Zoom. And just to quickly orient you to the format, you'll see in the menu on the bottom that there's opportunity for you to enter questions through the Q&A. So if at any point during the webinar you have questions that you want to ask our speaker, you can put those questions in there. We will see them. And at the end of the presentation, we'll pick a few to focus on. The webinar format doesn't allow for cameras or for attendees to speak. So just FYI, that's not an issue on your end. That's the design of the function. All right, and I just wanted to give you a quick overview of where this program fits for Ridgefield Library and Keeler Tavern Museum. We're partnering for this larger project. It's a dual track program series. It runs from now through till July of 2026. And it's meant to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which we are now under a year countdown till that date. And what we really want to do is help our audiences learn and explore what it's meant to be an American in the past, what it means to be an American today. And we're doing that by focusing on the Declaration of Independence, sort of collectively trying to increase our fluency around this really important document and its historical context and get more comfortable talking with each other about it. So we have two tracks in the program series. We have America 250 Community Conversations, which are facilitated conversations where you'll see Andy and I, maybe some other staff from our organizations, facilitating casual conversations with folks who decide to join, where we're going to do close readings of the Declaration, think about what it means to us today. Doesn't require any prior knowledge of the Declaration. It's just an opportunity for us to all get together and talk about it. And then we have this Declaration Deep Dive program track. And this is a speaker series where we invite scholars who have expertise around the Declaration and its historical context to share their insights. And just did want to mention we get support for this program through Connecticut Humanities, which has been a great partner for both of our organizations and is doing a large share of the sponsorship for this program. And then we also did get some additional promotional support from Ridgefield Commemorates America at 250, which is our town committee that has organized. We have a lot of interest in our town in Revolutionary history because of our own unique history around that with the Battle of Ridgefield. And so we have a lot of enthusiasm from the nonprofits and community members in our town, and we have that commission there. So as I mentioned, there's a series of programs. The next series is going to be September 21st. That's going to be Dr. Akil Amar in conversation with Ted Brewster, and they're going to be at the Ridgefield Library. If you want to see what programs are coming up or register for any of them, they're all free, courtesy Connecticut Humanities. You can do so either at the Ridgefield Library or at Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center's library website. Their website, our website. Okay, so now I'm thrilled to welcome our first speaker in the series, British writer and historian Peter Moore. And he's going to be talking about the transatlantic origins of Thomas Jefferson's fabled phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which should be familiar to most of us, most famous line of the Declaration of Independence. And so he's looking at a distinctly American ideal from a definitively British perspective. And he's going to be doing, in the book project that this comes from, he looks at a lot of significant British thinkers and to understand what their contributions are to this particularly important moment in American history. Peter teaches creative writing at the University of Oxford. He's the Sunday Times bestselling author of Endeavor and the Weather Experiment, the latter of which was a New York Times notable book of the year. and Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, Britain and the American Dream, 1740-1776, was published in 2023. Also, I know he's finishing up some exciting new work that hopefully he'll give us a little sneak peek at tonight at some point in the presentation. Peter, thank you so much for being here. Particularly, all should know he is here with us at midnight his time. And so I will hand things over to you.
Midnight, but I am awake. So however generous your funders are, they couldn't quite get me all the way to the library to be in person, which is a shame, but hopefully you can all hear me. I'm going to try a little bit of screen sharing. Just let me know if this works, okay? I just need to press a few buttons and does that look good to you?
It does.
Right, there we go. That was the one complicated thing I had to do, apart from telling you all about revolutionary history. Let me talk to begin with a little bit about the book and why on earth I'm writing this particular story. It's hopefully doesn't seem to you like too much of cultural appropriation. I just always felt that that especially over here in England where I'm quite near Oxford at the moment, but there's a complete absence of discussion about the American Revolution. You might not be surprised to hear that, but it's always a period that's really intrigued me. I'm really a historian of the 18th century, and you can't be a historian of the 18th century and miss out the Declaration of Independence and the American War that followed. A few other things though. I grew up quite near Lichfield in Staffordshire, which is where Samuel Johnson came from, and I was always very intrigued by Johnson's links with America. Particularly, there's a brilliant scholar called Jim Basker, who is very well known in the States. He's at Columbia University now, I think. He's done a lot of work on Samuel Johnson in particular, and I remember years ago reading a scholarly article that he wrote, which claimed that that phrase, the pursuit of happiness, was one that had kind of come from Johnson. And I was always interested in that cross-pollination of this idea of happiness, starting off in Johnson's mouth and ending up in Jefferson's, and wondering how that might be. And then there's this question of trying to better understand the relationship between Great Britain and the United States of America, two countries which are very similar in many respects, but also so different. I wanted to go back to the beginning to try and work out what the connection was and where the differences began. I've got family in America as well, in Westport, Connecticut, which I don't think is too far away from where you are. So that was another little catalyst. And a few years ago, I started thinking about this phrase of Jefferson's, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And really, it's the most quintessential of all sentences or phrases in America. You hear it as a stump speech among politicians all the time. It's constantly being reused in culture. But I thought it was a way of me examining some big ideas about the origins of the United States. So taking that particular phrase and splitting it into three parts, the three big nouns in there: life, liberty, and happiness, and structuring a book in that way. So you have the first third of the book about life, the second third about liberty, the third about happiness, and all the way trying to interrogate what these words meant and what the British contribution was to Jefferson's mode of thought as he wrote those words down. So the book covers the period 1740 to 1776. So broadly, this is a generation that precedes the Declaration, and I kind of conceived it as a British prehistory of the American Revolution. I felt really inspired by, or legitimized is maybe a better word, by, there's a wonderful quote from John Adams who said, What do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. So, really, this is a story which goes in advance of the fighting. But as Adams is pointing out there, and which I think we all know, that by the time the fighting begins, much of the thinking has been done. And it was the thinking that I was interested in. So, no battles today, unfortunately, for those of you who would like them. I'm going to start off with this picture, and rather than trying to do everything in this short presentation that I've got, which will be about half an hour, I guess, and then there's going to be time for questions. I wanted to do one thing in specific today, which was to look at the question of liberty, and in particular at the story of a man called John Wilkes. And when I say John Wilkes to you, a lot of you will immediately think of the man who shot Abraham Lincoln, and that's not the right John Wilkes at all, because there was another one roughly a century earlier. And let me tell you, I think he had a huge influence on the revolutionary period. And I'm going to go through his story today, but it begins really with me talking a little bit about English liberty. And this is really an emotional and cultural concept as much as anything at this point. The picture you see here is a kind of quintessential English landscape of the 18th century. You can see there's the parish church, there's the castle on the hill, there's the small holdings, there's the fields, there's the cottages behind. And this really is what people would have thought of when they heard that phrase, English liberty. And not only people in England, but one of the things that really struck me when I was starting out on the book was that you have to really invert the way, or the way that I think in specific about liberty, because today I think of liberty being something that we look west across the Atlantic to the land of liberty, to the United States of America, where this kind of great Republic of Freedom. And in the early 1700s, it was really the other way round, where you would have people. Hang on, I'm getting lots of links coming up on here, but I'm going to ignore those for the moment. Yeah, so you would have. Let me just get rid of that. You'd have people looking eastwards across the Atlantic to Great Britain, which was, in many people's minds, the epitome, the paragon of what a free and prosperous progressive society should be. And this is obviously the image that I've chose to represent that. But it was really a rare and quite fragile thing. Broadly, liberty meant freedom from tyranny, but more distinctly, people thought of it as the right to live with some independence within a legal system that protected them from the malignant reach of arbitrary powers in a property of their own that was safe from intruders. And this last point, this kind of safety of your home and the sanctity of private property, was a really powerful one. William Pitt the Elder, who was the great war hero, the kind of Churchill of the 7 Years' War, as we call it over here in the 1750s, early 1760s, talked about this. And he said, "The poorest man in his cottage may bid defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, its roof may shake, the wind may blow through it, the storm may enter, but the King of England may not enter. All his force dares not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement." And that was really the bedrock of English liberty, this idea of sanctity and freedom and safety from terror. And of course, when we talk about the English, there's always there's always this kind of idea of juxtaposing ourselves from the French, who did have an absolute monarch who could do all of those things that I was talking about just then. And as well as knowing where it came, what it was, people knew where English liberty came from. It had materialized 1,000 years before out of the wild woods of Saxony, and it had been carried across the sea to the island of Britain, often attacked in the years before and after the Norman conquest, when tyrannical kings snatched at the ancient freedoms of the Saxon communities. It had nonetheless survived to be fortified by Magna Carta. It had endured another series of formidable, violent, and bloody assaults during the time of the Stuarts in the 17th century, but the triumph of that time was that so far from being destroyed, the old English liberties were actually renewed at the Glorious Revolution. So the 17th century, for those of you who don't know English history so well, was a time of the first revolution is our own civil war in the 1650s, and then there was a bloodless one called the Glorious Revolution. And during this time, a series of really important formal laws were set down. So you had the elected House of Commons had to, the parliaments could only last for 7 years. There were limits on the powers of the monarch, who acted through ministers. There was the end of pre-publication censorship in 1695, habeas corpus, which was the most important of the liberty laws, if you like, the right to the right against lawful imprisonment. That was reinforced, and the idea was that when you put all of these laws together, they produced the greatest amount of freedom, but not only that, the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. And I think that's what I'm trying to emphasize here in this quite bucolic picture of the English countryside. But if we move on to 1762, which is really where my story is going to start today, this was very far from the rosy reality of British politics that I've been describing for you, because I believe you call it the French and Indian War in North America, but we call it the 7 Years' War, which ran from 1756 to 1763, a war in which Great Britain emerged triumphant, of course, but it was a very, very contested peace. So by 1762, of course, we have the new king on the throne, the young King George III. And he's ascended the throne with a real passion and a will to change the political consensus. He's got a kind of purifying mission, and he's fed up of the long, corrupt Whig consensus that has long dominated Westminster politics. And he's really removing one set of what he sees as corrupt ministers and replacing them with another. And this caused a huge amount of faction, as they called it at the time. So this was arguments between different political tribes. And of course, the big loser was William Pitt, who I mentioned before, the great war hero. It was a bit like maybe Churchill getting turfed out in 1945. Well, William Pitt had something very similar happen to him about this time. And in contrast to that, you have the favourite of King George, who was called Lord Bute, who was elevated to become Prime Minister. And so this caused a very rancorous, angry, febrile political environment, which is kind of captured here in this engraving by Hogarth, which is a really fun one for you to look up if you like, and it's just called The Times. But I'm going to move straight on to John Wilkes, who is the character I want to tell you about today. And here he is. John Wilkes was clever, he was witty, and in the early 1760s, he was in his late 30s. He was the Member of Parliament for Aylesbury, which is a small county town in Buckinghamshire, not so far from where I am, near Oxford. Edward Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, wrote about Wilkes in curiously ambivalent terms. He said that he scarcely ever met with a better companion. Wilkes was a man of inexhaustible spirits, infinite wit and humour, and a great deal of knowledge. He was very, very clever. But there was another side to Wilkes, which Gibbon moved on to straight after. He said he was thoroughly profligate in principle as well as in practice. His character was infamous, his life stained with every vice, and his conversation full of blasphemy and bawdy. These morals he glories in, for shame is a weakness he has long surmounted. So kind of curiously magnetic personality in a way. You might think he's not too different to the politicians of today in a way. He's very, very charismatic, but thoroughly immoral. And the first thing that people tended to notice about Wilkes may be disguised a little bit in this portrait, which shows him as a writer. He was a very good writer, but he was famously ugly. And he himself told the story that someone had once warned him that his face should not be exposed to pregnant women, which is quite a funny thought. Although he did remark in his own defense, and Wilkes was always the first person to laugh at himself. He said he could always talk away his own face in 25 minutes to any woman. So he was a kind of interesting compound of all sorts of things. But as I said before, he was a superb satirical writer. And if we remember the previous slides, 1762, when all of this rancor was beginning between the two political factions, the king, the young king on one side, and the old, angry, ousted ministers on the other, Wilkes was aligned to the faction that was being pushed out. And he was given a job by his patron, a man called Lord Temple, to write a very satirical and very biting weekly pamphlet, which he called the North Briton. And this was really scandalous. The North Briton pushed the limits of what you could say in public. Now, I said before that pre-publication censorship had ended, the press was free, that people could say what they liked. That's kind of true, but there was always limits, even as we discover today. There's lots of talk about free speech today, and it was a similar kind of consensus really back then. But Wilkes pushed things very far indeed, and in early 1763. The war was formally concluded with the Treaty of Paris, which he thoroughly disagreed with. He thought it was a bad idea to end a war that Britain was winning and winning well. And he was horrified when he saw that the French, as he perceived it, were given a very fair settlement by the terms of the treaty. And he blamed Lord Bute for this, of course, and he blamed all the people who were around the king. But on the 23rd of April 1763, he went one step further. He actually directly criticised King George himself, who he accused of, let me see if I've got the words here. He said that the king was prostituting the role of the crown, and he accused him, in essence, of lying to the British public in a speech in Parliament. Now, the number of the North Briton in which this was done was number 45. It was the 45th edition of the North Briton. And by this point, it was pretty much known that Wilkes was the author. He was writing anonymously. He was doing his best to make sure that it was printed by a clandestine network of printers. and he thought that he was protected because he had a special legal status as a member of parliament. Members of parliament could only really be arrested in three specific instances: if they'd committed a felony, if they were committing a breach of the peace, or if they were plotting treason. Those were the only three instances in which a member of parliament could be arrested. And furthermore, Wilkes didn't think that there was any evidence to connect him with the North Britain. But it was pretty much an open secret by this point, and very soon after number 45 was published, the king directed his chief ministers, his secretaries of state, to have Wilkes prosecuted to the, kind of the limit of the law, I think. And over the days that followed, this is at the end of April in 1763, a series of arrests started to take place. To begin with, it was minor people. These were the printers, the publishers, the booksellers, these kind of people. But then on the 30th of April 1763, Wilkes was targeted himself, and one contemporary put it rather colourfully, that the 30th of April 1763 contained such a series of singular and extraordinary transactions as perhaps are not to be equalled in the annals of any civilized nation. Now, everyone knows the 4th of July 1776. I'd make a really big case for the 30th of April 1763 being a big date in the century. Now, I'm going to tell you what happened, and I'm going to do this. Hopefully, this will be good fun. We've got some charts for you, or some maps for you to look at here. This is Georgian London, and for any of you who are familiar with London, you might be able to work out where we're talking now. But essentially, where you see New Palace Yard, which is on the kind of centre right of your screen, that's more or less where the Palace of Westminster stands today. This is where Big Ben is, next to the River Thames, which is just there. So you can see the side of the river, and a short distance away you see the location of John Wilkes as he woke up on the 30th of April 1763. The other characters that I've noted are what were then called the King's Messengers. These are like proto-policemen. This is before there was a police force in London. So these were people who had been stationed to apprehend Wilkes. They'd been given a warrant for his arrest. But interestingly, there was something about this warrant I should tell you about now, because it's very important. There was no name written on the warrant. It was a general warrant that was written to apprehend the writers, the printers, and the publishers of North Britain number 45. Okay, so Wilkes gets up. He stands. He walks out of his door on Great George Street. You can see there, and he turns to the left, and he's walking towards where Robert Blackmore is standing, and he confronts Wilkes. Blackmore does, and Wilkes. I don't know if this is a tip which would work today if you're about to be arrested, but Wilkes does something very, very British, which is quite enjoyable. He holds out his hand and he says, "Good morning to you, sir. Very nice to meet you." And Blackmore shakes his hand by instinct, because Wilkes was a gentleman, and he therefore demanded respect. And at that moment, Wilkes slipped past him, and he dashed all the way across London to see what was happening in Fleet Street. Now, this is the early morning of 30th of April 1763. Again, those of you who know London might be able to work out where we are. 17 Gough Square, that's where Dr. Johnson lived, just off Fleet Street. This is the great area of printers between the cities of London and the city of Westminster. And just where you can see the approximate location of Richard Balfe's printing shop is where Wilkes travelled to. And there's a wonderful section of description I didn't have time to go into this morning, where Wilkes attempts on his own this morning, having evaded the messengers, to print on his own number 45 North Britain and to keep the circulation going, because he's aware that he's going to be arrested at this point, and he feels that the best thing he can do is keep his publication going. But that doesn't really work out. The printing is beyond him. And by the mid-morning of the 30th of April 1763, we're back where we started in Westminster. During this whole time, there's been a massive manhunt for Wilkes. Where is he? There's people dashing all over London. And all of a sudden, he appears back outside his house, where the same messenger attempts to arrest Wilkes for a second time. And Wilkes says himself, I advised him to be very civil and to use no violence in the street, for if he attempted force, I would put him to death in the instant. But if he would come quietly into my house, I would convince him of the illegality of the warrant and the injustices of the orders he had received. So the messenger chose to accompany me into my house, and then he produced the general warrant. I declared that such a warrant was absolutely illegal and void in itself, that it was a ridiculous warrant against the whole English nation, and I asked him why he would serve it on me rather than on the Lord Chancellor, on either of the Secretaries of State, or on Lord Bute, or my next door neighbour, because nobody's name was mentioned. And what happens at this point? Well, I should point out that Wilkes has done something very clever by inviting the messenger to come in for breakfast in his house. He's essentially moved this encounter from the public highway into a private property. And this would be like kind of something which really inflamed the story later on. But the day was really spent in a period of farce where Wilkes politely declined to be arrested, and more people arrived, and he continued to claim that this warrant was illegal and he was not going to submit to it. Eventually, he did give his sword to one of the messengers. He took the names of everyone who was arresting him, and he was carried the very short distance to Lord Halifax's residence. Now, he's the Secretary of State, and he lives a few doors down the road, so it wasn't a very long journey, but it was one that Wilkes was sure was illegal. And what he'd been doing for this entire time was essentially trying to buy time for himself to get a writ of habeas corpus from the Court of Common Pleas carried to his house to kind of overturn the warrant and to frustrate the ministry's attempts to arrest him. It doesn't work, and I'm going to cut a very long and amusing story short by telling you that John Wilkes ended the evening of the 30th of April 1763 in the Tower of London. Now, it's probably worth at this point pointing out why I'm telling you this story, because you might wonder why this kind of arrest of an MP from a provincial town in England has anything to do with Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. Well, at this point in the pre-revolutionary story, there was an obsession with British politics in American newspapers, in political life, in polite society. It's been a point well made by many historians that the first page of American newspapers usually contained news from England, which was quite strange if you think of the 3,000 miles which divided them from the small events that were being reported. But with Wilkes in particular, his story cut through very, very quickly. So this, you can see here, is one of the very first reports to be printed in America. Yesterday morning, John Wilkes, Esquire, member for Parliament for Aylesbury, and so on. But then this story developed, and number 45, North Britain, was reprinted in its entirety in the New York Gazette. And Benjamin Franklin had to step in to stop David Hall, who was by then managing the Pennsylvania Gazette, for him from reprinting it himself. So the story quickly made its way across the Atlantic. And one of the weird things I found was that really some of the best material to be found about the Wilkes case in 1763 and later on was to be gathered from the American newspapers, because there was this huge appetite for the story. And I think the reason for that is one that's worth pondering. And scholars have long talked about, the big question is, why did the revolution happen? Was it an ideological revolution? Was it an economic problem? These are the two big schools of thought. But one very persuasive idea, and one I believe was put down by Bernard Bailyn, the Harvard professor, in his Pulitzer Prize winning book in the 1960s, when he talked about the paranoia of the colonists, that their liberty was going to be taken away from them. And Wilkes's story played into that paranoia. It was something they were incredibly sensitive towards. So if you look at American newspapers, which are so freely and readily available online now, throughout the summer of 1763, you can follow this wonderful case in all of its detail. And Wilkes's story was only just beginning. I'll just give you the bones of it now, because I don't want to waste too much time on all of it. But having evaded the establishment once in April, I should say, he managed to argue his case successfully in the case in the Court of Common Pleas. He was released from the Tower. When he was taken back to his home in Great George Street, he was accompanied by crowds of 30,000 people, it was estimated. He made a very famous speech on the day of his hearing, which said, "In my case, this day is a question of such importance as to determine at once whether English liberty be a reality or a shadow." And that was a line that was really repeated a lot in the colonies. And after this, as I said, his story developed in a very bizarre and wild way. Later on that year, he fell foul of the establishment once again, and he was prosecuted, this time for seditious writing. He was first off disgraced in Parliament, then he ended up fighting a duel in Hyde Park, then fled to Paris, and he was branded an outlaw the next year. So by 1764, a lot of people in Britain thought that Wilkes was a cause célèbre, but really someone who'd been neutralized by by the political establishment. But actually, and I don't want to draw any parallels with modern American political history, but you can if you like. In 1768, there was a general election in Great Britain, and Wilkes, who by that point was confronting a huge number of court cases which were intended to silence him, he was heavily in debt, so he could be arrested at any moment on the streets of London. And he was an outlaw, so he had no protection of the common law. He decided to return to London anyway and stand as a parliamentary candidate. And it's one of the great stories in British political history, because he does actually manage to win the seat of Middlesex, which is one of the counties that sprawls over London. And how he did that was a kind of sheer act of bravado. There was such a huge popular support for him that the establishment really, I suppose, lost their courage. They failed to prosecute him. With every passing day, more people followed him. His followers were called the Sons of Liberty, which again might be an echo for you in the States. And when he was re-elected to Parliament, it created a really strange legal dilemma because he was an elected representative of the people, but at the same time he was an outlaw and he was a debtor and he was confronting all of these legal cases. And so that took a lot of took a lot of lawyers' times to work out what was going to happen. That's a separate story, but you can see this is a little broadside, sorry, little illustration of Wilkes being drawn triumphantly through the streets of London. Um, and the real like kind of impact of this in the colonies was huge. Just as people had followed his case in 1763, so they did in 1768. And there was there was a kind of really interesting connection with him and the Sons of Liberty of Boston. And they really watched Wilkes in wonder. In July 1768, by which time Wilkes was again in prison, he received a memorial from the Committee of the Sons of Liberty, and they explained that they'd gathered at the Whig Tavern in Boston to honour Wilkes, and that they regarded him as an incomparably honest man, reserved by heaven to bless and perhaps save a tottering empire. Now, there's a chronological convergence here, which is really interesting. I should say as well before I get onto that Wilkes replied to these people, which included Benjamin Kent and Thomas Young and Benjamin Church and John Adams and Joseph Warren. He wrote back saying, "Liberty I consider as the birthright of every subject of the British Empire, and I hold Magna Carta to be in as full force in America as in Europe." So he was a real kind of source of inspiration there. But this is the chronological convergence because this is 1768, where you have the British troops being sent across, marching down the Long Wharf at Boston at the same time as news of the Wilkes affair is being received. And that the kind of charges this story with so much emotional power. Um, this is what Bernard Bailyn says about Wilkes. He says John Wilkes's career was crucial to the colonists' understanding of what was happening to them. His fate, the colonists came to believe, was intimately involved with their own. Not only was he associated in their minds with general opposition to the government that passed the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties that were flooding the colonies with parasitic placemen, and that appeared to be making inroads into the constitution by weakening the judiciary and bestowing monopolies of public offices on pliant puppets. Not only was he believed to be a national leader of opposition to such government, but he'd entered the public arena first as a victim and then as the successful antagonist of general warrants, which, in the form of writs of assistance, the colonists too had fought in heroic episodes known throughout the land. He had, moreover, defended the sanctity of private property against the confiscation of government. His cause was their cause. His number 45 North Britain was as celebrated in the colonies as it was in England, and more generally approved of. Its symbolism became part of the iconography of liberty in the colonies. And so that's just one of the stories that I tell in this book. And I'll kind of whiz through this part now, so we've got some time for questions. But all of these three here, obviously John Adams, because we talked about him before, certainly Benjamin Franklin, because he wrote about him, and Thomas Jefferson as well, they would have all known about John Wilkes. So that word liberty in Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Happiness would have had a very personal kind of resonance with Wilkes at the time. The chant Wilkes and Liberty was one which really kind of resounded throughout Great Britain, resounded throughout the colonies. The chant number 45 was the great revolutionary number. Um, Again, there's a bit of an echo today in our own times. And I'll go through some of the other echoes very quickly. This is another of my characters, William Strahan, who was a great friend of Benjamin Franklin and a printer in London. He said, "I wish the liberty and happiness of all of our brethren with you." This is Catherine Macaulay, who was a Republican, probably the first best-selling lady historian in modern history. And she says it's only the democratical system rightly balanced which can secure the virtue, liberty, and happiness of society. That's 1767. This is Johnson. I can't quite read his out because his words are hidden behind some phrase there. But this is the idea of the pursuit of happiness coming from Johnson. Thomas Paine, again, talking about happiness as an ideal. The science of the politician consists in fixing the true point of happiness and freedom. Those men would deserve the gratitude of ages that should discover a mode of government that contained the greatest sum of individual happiness with the least national expense. And Franklin himself talking about happiness as being rather like the weather. I'm not going to read that one out now because we're short on time, but you might note that it's an interesting portrait of Franklin and not one which is quite so familiar to us today. So all of that is kind of there in the book, and the story of Wilkes was a fabulous one to research, and it's one where you can see direct connections. These two countries in direct interaction with an event in a small part of Westminster having huge flashback across the other side of the Atlantic and then becoming something else. And I think there's something in that which is the truth of history, I feel. And that's what I wanted to capture in the book. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if you've got any questions, please do ask.
Thanks, Peter. That was excellent. I know I have some questions. Wait to see if we did have somebody who wanted to know, is there any connection to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania with your Wilkes?
Yes, exactly. So that was named. So I'm always a bit timorous about pronouncing that because I never know the second half. How do you pronounce the second half?
Yeah, so I lived there for a little bit. It's Wilkes-Barre, but if you are a local, it's Wilkes-Barre. But
Yeah,
that
okay.
you really have to have been there for generations.
So you can see why I don't go there very
Yeah.
often in the pronunciation sense. Yeah, so that's John Wilkes. That's where that name came from. But then the second name, which is in Unity, which I won't pronounce as I say, is that was the name of someone who also stood up in the House of Commons um, and basically attacked the ministers, the Grenville, the nasty kind of mean ones who were sending the armies across, who stood up and said, "This is ridiculous. Why are we attacking our own, kind of cousins?" And so, yeah, that's Wilkes there. Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. We have somebody who's asking just for a clarification when you talked about the 3 reasons for Wilkes's arrest. You said one was plotting treason.
So no, that's not 3 reasons for his arrest. So there were only 3 scenarios in which a member of the House of Commons could be arrested. The first of which was if they'd committed a felony. The second of which was if they were guilty of a breach of the peace. And the third of which was if they were plotting treason, which is obviously the worst of the. And Wilkes didn't think he was doing any of those, so he thought his parliamentary privilege should be able to protect him. And that actually, to be honest, to get into the neat legal nitty-gritty, that was correct because in the Court of Common Pleas, after he went to the Tower of London, that was the violation, and that was why he was released because they wanted to uphold his parliamentary privilege. And yeah, it's a really interesting legal case on as
Yeah.
well as anything else.
And this person's following up. They're asking if there are any other American political supporters who were also arrested on any of those grounds around that time.
Well, the big thing is the writ of assistance. I'd look at that because if you want to, because obviously different jurisdictions, different colonies did things in different ways. I'm talking about Great Britain. Um, but the general warrants case with Wilkes was obviously particular to England because we've even got distinct law from Scotland. And in was it in Massachusetts you had the writs of assistance case? You can go and have a look at that, but it's a very, very similar question because it again comes down to liberty and the sanctity of property and people violating that. So you might want to go and investigate that as a kind of connected issue. Yeah.
Speaking of property, we have a couple of people, and this was on my radar too, thinking about pursuit of happiness. There's been scholarship around that that links happiness as really meaning property rights. And we have a couple of people who are asking about that. This is sort of coming from Locke.
Yeah, well, comes from Locke. Yeah, so there's a modification with so happiness was, and you're right, you're absolutely right. There's some wonderful work going on about happiness being the big driving force of the Enlightenment. This kind of quest to move away from maybe what you would call a pre-Enlightenment society where there was a big emphasis on getting safely and happily to heaven, or if you were going to have any happiness, it would be in the afterlife. Whereas the 18th century was a kind of more impatient because they wanted to have happiness on earth before they got to wherever they were going. And so some great scholarship about that. I think property and happiness are the distinct concepts. And yeah, I've got quite a lot to say on that because I think that's between Locke and Jefferson. You see the kind of the pivot from like this kind of idea of property maybe being the foundation of happiness, but then happiness actually becoming like kind of more prominent and something, I suppose, in a way, like we think of happiness as more of an emotional thing today, like the happy emoji. To them, it was more of a settled state of tranquility, something a bit more Epicurean. That's probably a good way to term it. And yeah, I hope that answers kind
Oh,
of.
that's great. Yeah. Um, a couple more clarification questions. How long was Wilkes in prison and how did his life end?
Yeah. Okay. So Wilkes was in prison on various occasions. So the first time he was there for, I guess, 10 days, 2 weeks, that kind of time, in 1763. Um, if you fancy some fun history, you should read about Wilkes's story later in the year because it gets really crazy. But like latterly, when he comes back, you see, because we ended up in this legal tangle with him being re-elected in 1768 because he was an outlaw, and can an outlaw sit in the British Parliament? A massive question. Um, and what happened then was that he was jailed for 2 years at the end of the seventh. So after this kind of subsequent return, so 1768 to 1770, he was in the King's Bench prison. But he lived, it was like Wilkes's palace. People used to it wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad prison. It wasn't like going to the Bastille. He had his suite of apartments and he used to dine on roasted turtle in the staterooms and things. So, yeah, very nice prison, I suppose.
Sure. Excellent. I wanted to pick up because when you're talking, I liked your encouraging us to think about modern day parallels. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is the sort of this tension. First of all, I love the idea that there's a ideological economic, but then there's sort of like this like celebrity culture reason for promoting some of these ideals of the Declaration. But so when you talk about um, this idea that he's an outlaw, right, and that he builds this cult of personality and around this idea of being an outlaw and evading the establishment. I think this is really interesting. At our museum, when we talk about the American Revolution, we'll talk about some of the language that people use to identify, because a lot of Americans are used to thinking about, well, obviously the Patriots won, right? And obviously the Patriots were in the right. And so we're trying to orient them and get them to think about, well, it was actually really risky to go against the crown. And so we try and emphasize that word rebel a lot, right? Like that people are rebelling or being part of an insurrection, if we want to think about like more modern connections as well, right? And could you maybe talk a little more about that, like that particular notion of outlaw or rebel or
Well, I
insurrectionist?
think, yeah, I mean, so he really epitomized this idea of someone who, I mean, he had huge personal courage. Whatever you think about Wilson, there are people
Yep.
who don't even think he's a serious character because
Mm,
he was so um, like, did he actually care about liberty, or was it a way of him attaching his own cult of personality to a broader cause and then like
yeah.
kind of using that as a shield? And so this again might feel very modern to you.
Mm,
This is a valid question, but what he did in a way is that like we're people, right? We respond to people, like, and I
mhm,
think in any movement you need to have a figurehead. It's all right having ideas are fine, but they kind of float around in the ether. What you really need is someone to give you like kind of a sense of purpose and a sense of style and a sense of delivery and like kind of animation. And I think he probably did that. And I suppose what I was kind of hinting at with um, like kind of this connection with the Sons of Liberty in Boston is that at this point, these are kind of quite respectable, gentlemanly characters who are like
mm,
local lawyers or whatever. So, what is the thing which turns those people into revolutionaries or rebels? Because like we all think of, we kind of have our polite jobs, we do what we do in the day, and like the idea of like kind of taking that step and saying no, I don't think this is right, or I don't
mhm,
believe in this. That's the kind of the critical step in a way, because then after that you're there, you're going. And I suppose why I think Wilkes does matter is that I think it's a question of chronology, because if you look at when these events were happening and you look at how widely they were reported, they could have been like kind of fundamental to that transformation of people who are actually much more central to the story, the John Adamses or whatever
mhm.
that come afterwards. Um, so yeah, I think it might be the law of unintended consequences, the Lorenz effect or whatever, the butterfly wing thing.
Yeah,
But I think that's how history works: is something happens somewhere and there's something goes off somewhere else. And the way I kind of came to think about the American Revolution actually was that it was like always following these newspaper reports from, because that's for me that it's great fun to read them, but they are the first draft of history, as people say, journalism is. And you could see how stories change in a way as they go.
yeah,
So something that might be quite trivial in one place takes on huge resonance somewhere else. And especially when you're putting it alongside things like the Stamp Act or Townshend duties or whatever, that, kind of brings everything to light, I think. Yeah.
yeah. That's really we do a lot looking at comparing the British newspaper's take of the Battle of Ridgefield versus the American newspaper's take of the Battle of Ridgefield. And the British didn't even call it a battle; they called it a skirmish, right? They said it was no big deal, right? And so I'd imagine that there's similar the English newspapers are doing something depicting that story very differently than how we're seeing this
Yeah, I think
storytelling
today,
evolve and grow.
but I mean, it's great today because we're much more, I think, because the media's developed so much, we talk about narratives. Everyone's always talking
Yeah,
about narratives and news
yeah,
cycles, but they didn't have this vocabulary to understand things because it was all so new. I mean, the
yeah,
first proper daily newspapers weren't really around until the early 1700s.
yeah.
And so journalism was kind of finding its feet and
Mm.
it was pretty raucous. But I mean, one of the great joys of my life is just reading 18th century newspapers because they're always interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, anyway, that's I think that's kind of where my interest lies, I suppose.
yeah, absolutely. All right, we have one more, if you don't mind, we have one more question with somebody who's asking if you could just say a little bit more about, and this was very interesting to me too, the paranoia of the colonists and how that shapes the revolution.
Yeah, well, so again, this kind of plays with the last point that
Yeah.
I was making, but so like the big one of the big questions, so maybe if you were to boil down like kind of a lot of the, the events down to like kind of one of the big ideological questions is um where sovereignty lay. Okay, so sovereignty basically meaning who has the final say. Okay,
Yeah.
like you have the Supreme Court today is the final say. Okay, um in um in the colonial world it was Westminster. So there was a kind of a governance issue here. And I think if you imagine what that did to your psychology, feeling that you were being controlled from a distance. So everything you did was kind of subservient to a band. I mean, and let me tell you how the British Parliament was elected in the 18th century. There was, well, it was very corrupted. There were all these rotten boroughs. People were just like kind of had hereditary estates, and some of the most foolish people in our history would sit in these parliaments. And so if you're, say, just a kind of John Adams-ish kind of character, or it could be anyone, anywhere, and you feel that somewhere far away you're being controlled by an invisible force. This is almost like the definition of some kind of, like, I don't know, psychological disorder, isn't it? So you can
Yeah.
see why paranoia comes. And so when people are paranoid, they look for like positive proof of whatever theory they have. And once a paranoia takes hold of someone, they're kind of very difficult to move out of that state. And I think that is a hugely, well, for me, I think it's a hugely powerful factor in why the separation happened when it did. Because there's two, I suppose, questions is like, was the separation going to come? But it came really early, like the colonies were like still quite young when the revolution happened. And I think you've got to kind of work out why did that happen so quickly. And I think paranoia is probably a good it's a good road of inquiry, let's put it that way.
Excellent. Could I give you, to wrap up, could I give you a minute to talk about your current book project?
Sure. So so prior to this book, I wrote another one which was a biography of a ship called Endeavour, which was the first ship that James Cook sailed on his South Sea circumnavigation. And so I'm kind of into ships, as I've explained to you before, Katie. And I've gone back to sea again because it's just so much fun. So I've written a biography of a man called Thomas Cochrane, who, after Horatio Nelson, was the great naval figure, really, of the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. He was also the member of Parliament for Westminster, so more politics. But it's kind of a generation or two after this story. So in the kind of romantic age. So I think, here in the 1760s, 1770s, you do get these very rough around the edge characters like Wilkes and whoever else. They're a bit more refined 50 years down the line, but they're taking this story about democracy forward. And
Mm.
yeah, it's been great. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. And that book is coming soon. Should we be on the
Yeah,
lookout?
next year. Well, I don't know. I've just sent it to my editor. I don't know. I don't know. I'm as interested as you are. I've no idea.
Okay, great.
If all goes well, maybe. But yeah,
Wonderful.
real pleasure to talk to you today, and I hope it was useful. And it's a great series, so good luck with it.
Yeah, thank you so much for ending your long day with us. This was fantastic. We're excited to get feedback from folks. Feel free to reach out to Ridgefield Library or Keeler Tavern Museum and join us for our upcoming programs. Thank you so much again, Peter.
Great pleasure.
Yeah, have a good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye bye.